is there any community announcements or anything? I know there's a startup week thing that Mary here will talk about.
I'm just taking the mic. Hey, everyone. My name is Mary, and in 2 weeks, we will be having Startup Week. So it's a week of over 100+ community-led events, and it's around entrepreneurship. It's around technology, innovation, networking, basically a celebration of our entrepreneurial community, and that's a lot of different people doing a lot of really cool things. So I encourage you to go online. You can check out the schedule, startupweekcha.com, and whether you're looking to meet new people in the community, whether you're want to learn more about innovation in healthcare, there's a lot of different things that week that are exciting and that our community is bringing together. So it's a great week for you, and just encourage you to go check that out and make a schedule. Thanks.
Thank you, Mary. Any other community announcements? Okay.
November 13th is the Chattanooga Devops Days Conference. It's the first one in Chattanooga. The schedule is up and our speakers are up, so you can see who's talking. We're doing a little bit different. We're doing tech talks and open spaces. So if you don't like talking to other people, we won't make you. And tickets are for sale on the site.
Thank you. Any others? Okay.
Hey guys, I'm Anna Sherman. We're having an Elixir Bridge October 19th and 20th here. You can sign up on Bridge Troll right now. It's the only one in Chattanooga happening. So, and then the following week, Friday and Saturday, is Gig City Elixir, which is a functional programming conference. It's not just Elixir. If you're into functional programming or you're curious about it, it's a pretty good conference for that. There's going to be a lot of like intro stuff from people who are big in the communities, like the creator of Haskell, and people who are big in Clojure will also be there. So check it out, Gig City Elixir.
Okay. Any others? Okay, so there's 2 things for me to bring up then. The Python Meetup is this coming Monday. I believe they start at 6, and they'll be here on the 5th floor, I believe. And also, we are in the 2nd week of Hacktoberfest. So who here is participating in it so far? Okay, so we got a couple. Who has already gotten at least 1 pull request in? Nice. So for those who don't know what Hacktoberfest is, it is a month-long hackathon being put on by DigitalOcean, GitHub, and Trello. And the goal is to get 5 pull requests into an open source project. It doesn't have to be accepted or anything by the end of the month, but you just have to get them in. And if you get your 5 in, you will get a t-shirt and some swag from DigitalOcean. So you can sign up for that at hacktoberfest.digitalocean.com. There's just a simple button that you click to sign up. It'll ask you to authenticate with GitHub, and then they'll just track your pull requests from there. With that out of the way, I'll go ahead and announce this week's speaker, of Paul Schreiner, and he will tell us when the GDPR does not apply.
Let me get this right to not be forgotten. It's like my mom putting my corsage on for homecoming. I mean, no. So, favorite time of the year, because there are so many events, developer conferences and stuff in town, so it's always free lunches. Miller Plaza, I'm not kidding. Like, our office is across the street from Miller Plaza, and every day I look out, I'm like, free? Yeah, no, this is the time of the year. And actually, thanks for the Devops conference. I think that sounds like a should attend type of conference. So today we're talking GDPR again. I know, you're right. Seriously, Paul, another GDPR talk. And that is a fair criticism However, I think I had a dinner with a colleague in San Francisco who really challenged me on some things. You know, we at AudiencePoint, because we work with a lot of customers out of the EU and sort of globally, we really kind of leaned into GDPR, the General Data Protection Regulation. It's the legislation that was passed by the European Union that anyone who is a part of the EU it applies to, or anyone who is in the EU who's coming to the United States it applies to. So it kind of applies to everyone. Now, let's start with just that privacy is a good thing, that GDPR is a good thing, and that was the overall sort of consensus of this conversation that I had. But again, this conversation challenged me to look a little deeper, to this whole concept of the specifics of the GDPR law. What are the problems with it, and sort of how do we handle that? And actually, it kind of leads to a nice challenge, if you will. So I thought, let's calibrate first. Meaning, there's probably some of you here who don't know anything about GDPR. There's some of you who now know at least 2 talks previous about GDPR. And so there's a whole bunch of aspects of it, okay? The high points, the things that are really going to apply to everything, comes down to sort of the rights of an individual or a digital subscriber rights. Those are the 2 kind of packages for these, essentially like 7, 8 things. There's also, you know, depending on whether or not you were a data controller, the person who actually collects the data, or a data processor, there's rules that you have to abide by. But in general, these are the things that we're kind of all looking at going, this is what impacts us. The right to be able to access your data. I want to know what your company, City of Chattanooga, knows about me, Paul Schreiner. I want to be able to access that. And that's not just like my home address, all that stuff. I want to know everything that you know about me, right? The right to access, right to rectification. If while I'm accessing that data, I realize that some of that data is incorrect or wrong, I want to be able to correct that data, right? Makes sense. Right to be forgotten. I moved from Chattanooga, right? And while I'm here, I think it makes sense for Chattanooga to know that my trash day is Tuesday. But as soon as I leave, maybe I want them no longer to know the number of people living in my house, right? There's things that you might want. So that's called the right to be forgotten, right to erasure, right to data portability, meaning when I leave Chattanooga, I'd like to be able to bring all of that data with me. I'd like to be able to download it to my hard drive and go. Right to restrict the processing of personal data. Like, I'm happy for you guys to have my data, but I really don't want you to process it. I don't want you to generate any sort of aggregate values about me, okay? So these are good things. Right to object to the processing of personal data. Right to object to the processing of personal data for direct marketing purposes. There's lots of little nuances here. And just because these rights exist doesn't mean it's a no-go, right? We consent. That's a big thing. Like, you can still do this stuff providing you ask for consent, right? That's the key. The consent must be unambiguous. It needs to be real clear and direct, and the customer should be able to withdraw the consent easily, quickly, in a very, like, hey, here's all of the things I've consented to, and being able to remove it. And then, so there you go. All right, everyone in a good place? Love it. Okay, so we know data privacy is important. We know that there's legislation that protects us from bad actors, from bad people. We are good people. We're the good guys. We don't do bad things. That's the other people. Or maybe it's the other people using the good things that we're doing to do bad things. It doesn't matter. The point is, in principle, in general, I think that legislation is a good thing. It protects us. It protects us from the bad people, right? So we can argue about the nuances of one particular program versus another program on why this one protects us better than that one. But in general, the idea that legislation is a good thing, that's positive. We talked about this. Who does it apply to? And so this is specifically GDPR, but this is also the California Data Protection Law, right? So if you are marketing, and it's not just marketing, sorry, let's back off. I live in the marketing world. If you are working with customers from the EU, it applies to you. If EU citizens come to the United States and you work with them here, it applies to you. That's how the GDPR law works. The California Data Protection Law, if you are working with businesses in California, it applies to you, or residents of California. If you're working with residents of California in other states, it applies to you. So and we're going to kind of unravel this a little bit more. The right to be forgotten, this is the one that sort of everyone's got their undies in a bunch about, and probably should. This is, I think, as I was kind of peeling back the layers on the onion, this is the one that sort of got everyone concerned. This is the catalyst for our conversation. Like, even just Googling it, this is by far the most hit. 284 million, 100 million results. Whatever, you get it. This isn't, yeah. Tens of hundreds of people. Now, it's easy. Like, I don't have any problem villainizing marketers, right? We are bad people. Unless you're all marketers, then we're great people, aren't we? But in general, like, marketers, we want to sell more things that maybe you don't want, right? But again, it's sort of understanding things. So it's really easy to look at the whole industry and go, well, it's the marketers, they're bad. GDPR, sure. I don't want you to know my household income. Erase, right? I mean, that's your initial response. It's that industry piece. This is where it gets a little more tricky. So Google, this was from February 28th, right? So this is before the GDPR legislation even kicked in, which was May 24th. They had 650,000 right to be forgotten requests, okay? Which means you contact Google and you say, I don't want you to know anything about me anymore. It means all of their search results. It means I don't want you to have a Gmail account. I don't want you to keep any of that archived. There's legal implications to that. I don't want you to know anything about me. Now, we're talking about maybe a local company here. Oh, it's a big move. I don't care, right? But when we get bigger, then we start to ask that question of, is this a good idea? Is GDPR a good idea? Again, going back to the beginning, yes, data privacy is a good thing, but let's look deeper at this piece. Because when you get deeper and you start looking at the courts and you say, I want convictions that were public taken off my public record. So now you can apply for a job, and maybe you had a white-collar crime that you don't want to show up. That's the idea. Google lost their right to be forgotten case. They said, no, we are not going to forget people. This was in Japan. That specific case, there was actually 2 of them. And they both had been convicted of conspiring to account falsely. So creative bookkeeping, if you will. One of them won their case and said, I want my right to be forgotten, and they were able to be forgotten from Google. The other one didn't. Google said they'd accept their rulings because legally they had to. This represents maybe a bigger challenge because what else could be impacted, right? What about sex offenders moving into your neighborhood? I can ask for that to be forgotten. That's a big deal. Now we're dealing with sort of crime and the digital trail that we leave. Sometimes maybe we shouldn't forget that information, right? And when we come in with this perspective that, yeah, we love it, forget everything, we've got some challenges. Because we're not talking about single cases anymore. We're talking about sort of cases building on top of cases on top of cases. And I'm not an attorney. I never ever have I claimed that. I just have claimed to say this is something I want to know a lot about because it impacts our business. All right, what about the journalistic exemption, right? If I'm a reporter and I report about something, so if the Chattanooga Times Free Press writes an article about Paul Schreiner, and maybe it's a positive article, maybe it's a negative article, and I say I want to have that forgotten about me. There's a journalistic exemption that says within the Gdpr that says you're good. But the problem is these are big, broad, sweeping structures, right? Like they're not ever meant to be a single thing. They're meant to be a framework by which we follow. GDPR does not offer a blanket exemption from data protection for journalists. As it's been tested, journalists have had to sort of accommodate. Now, it's not 100%, but at the same time, maybe, just maybe, things should be remembered, right? Not everything, but there probably should be this bigger piece of like, what are we? What are we tracking? How are we tracking this? And where are we going, right? The argument, and this was probably like a 5-hour dinner that sort of prompted this talk. And we've already kind of talked about sort of crime. That's an easy one to be like, okay, so in our legislation, what we'll say is if you've been convicted of a crime, okay, so now we've got one little checkbox, right? But what about politicians, right? I want to run for office, and I want to make it so no one can Google, my history. So now it's just, no, I'm good. I didn't do anything wrong because I've had my right to be forgotten exercised. And when you think about who's creating or passing this legislation, all of a sudden, a bit of that nepotism starts to kick in where you're like, maybe that legislation is a little bit self-serving because what we're talking about now is not just crime and politics and all that, but we're talking about sort of the right to forget history, right? Now, again, I'm not by any means suggesting GDPR is bad. We don't have legislation here yet, at least in the state of Tennessee, which is good. Now, I thought this might be a controversial slide. However, I'll go with it, right? I mean, one of the things when I've had conversations with other GDPR people, other privacy people, they're saying, but we have Donald Trump. We don't have to worry about privacy or these kinds of things. And that's probably true for now, right? That it probably buys us some time before that sort of regulation falls down, cascades down on top of us. We have Trump, but there's already exceptions, right, to everything, because there's no way, like our economy runs on credit scores. That's how it works. We like to over-leverage our citizens so they're trapped in going to their jobs every day. Is that too dark? It might be. That's not, we can edit that out after, right? Good, perfect. Because the deal is, even with Trump right now, the pendulum is going to swing. It's going to go back the other way, right? And I know, I chose this one on purpose. Here it goes. Wait for it. And there it is. Okay. The pendulum's going to swing the other way, right? Right now we have this sort of administration that's anti-regulation, but it's going to go the other way, right? And here's the problem with that. Right now, we're talking about federal legislation, but it's coming down to the state level. This becomes a states' rights issue, right? So now, instead of it being federal legislation that we can all follow and all agree to, like, hey, this is good, now we're all held to state-by-state basis. Is that customer in Mississippi, or are they in California? Now we've got this logistical nightmare of how we're processing data. So it's going to be like, well, let's identify the most common standard. Because the reality is that California is there now, but there are states getting in line to protect their customers, their constituents. Now, the California Consumer Privacy Act of 2018 does not include a right to be forgotten, okay? For what it's worth. The point of this talk wasn't necessarily to show why we need to not have a right to be forgotten, but to more bring up that concept of maybe this is a lot more complicated, and we like to make it out, right? When we get back to that digital subscriber rights, individual rights, I mean, we've only talked about the right to erasure, right? We also have the right to be informed, the right to access, the right to rectification, and we can argue about all of these, and we can unravel all of these and come up with the ways that maybe, just maybe, it's an overreach. Regardless, we know it's going to be a mess, right? We know that all of these regulations are going to come down, and it's going to be a mess. I know. I'm sorry. Giphy is a problem for me. I'm a junkie. You know, anytime I have a presentation, I'm like, well, let's just check Giphy. Yeah, that'll work. We know that this data privacy, how we handle data, all of this is going to be a mess. Which brings up that the wave is coming. We know it's going to hit. Like, here we are standing, looking out, and we're saying, we know data privacy, we know data regulation, we know all of those pieces are going to come. We know we're on the precipice, if you will. We have one option. We can ignore it. I know, Giphy, I'm sorry. We can ignore the regulations. Yes, it's an option. I mean, that's what we've been doing, right? Like, we're going to handle just what we handle internally. We'll be fine. The problem is then stupid people get put in charge, right? If we ignore things, then what happens? I know it's coming. Yeah, you knew it was. I'm thinking maybe I shouldn't do Giphy in the future, but who knows? When we don't put ourselves in the middle of this debate, this discussion, in the middle of all of this, other people take control. And that's where that nepotism piece is a problem. And this is the hope that I kind of wanted to leave us all with in that discussion around digital privacy rights. We actually, it's this run-up between where we are right now and when the regulations come is a really interesting opportunity. Because when those regulations hit, it will change how we do business. It will change how we interact with computers, right? Or phones, or whatever it is. Anywhere that we have data involved, it will change it, right? The whole concept of GDPR is it returns the control of the data to the person that owns it themselves, right? It will change how we've done. So how does that do that? And this is, whoops. And this is the part that I think is the most interesting for me. All of this set up this single slide. So how do we do that? How do we set the standard? I would start with, we become advocates and experts for data security, for data, how it's handled, all of those pieces. At this point, most of you are not setting policy in your company. Some of you are. Awesome. That's the thing, is where we need to sort of understand the data security issue better than anyone else in the company, right? We are the advocates, we are the experts. And when you are the advocate or experts, you get brought in to say, hey, I want to talk about this, right? Because now you're the smartest person in the room, right? So now you can kind of start that conversation. But so just being an advocate or expert isn't always enough, because like at our organization, you can have a good idea, but if it conflicts with policies, these are policies that we've published out to our customers saying, here are the things that we abide by, right? Those policies are our gospel, right? So for me, being able to impact policy, how they are written and how they are enforced, that has huge impact at my local level. And as you can probably imagine, this is going to keep going out, right? So to that end, once you have those policies in place as an organization, now we can start talking about sort of how data is collected, how data is stored, where it's stored. We can start influencing sort of the day-to-day sort of process. But also even like the tools that we build, right? We have a lot of power in our organizations. And I'm not suggesting slow walking things or, being overly aggressive on another topic, but the idea that like the right to be forgotten tools, those are super important. That is part of GDPR, and we will have to support that, right? But as we build the tools, the administrative backend tools, what are the ones that we're building that make our lives easier, that are consumer focused, that are backend focused, that allow us to better secure data? One of the things that we did is we made it so there's no PII that ever shows up on an individual developer's workstations. PII, personally identifiable information. That can be, according to European standards, it's awesome because I don't even need to know your email address, first name, last name, any of that stuff. If I can triangulate who you are based on pieces of data, that's PII, right? So one of the things that we've said is we just don't want that on employee workstations, such that if my laptop is in my car and gets stolen, I don't have to worry at all about data leak, right? I don't have to worry about that because there's no data that can be there. Now, could a rogue engineer keep some data on their local machine and have it stolen? Of course. But now as an organization, because we have a policy and we enforce that policy, we can say they were rogue. As opposed to, like it's sort of kind of that concept of building the culture. We're building the culture within AudiencePoint of safety, security, of protecting customer data. And then on top of that, once we have those pieces, what are the consents that you're collecting? It's overkill right now because you don't have to do that, right? But at the same time, consent is the basis of GDPR. It's going to be the basis of all of this. I give you my email address. I allow you to do X, Y, and Z with it, period. Now we have a table in our database called consents. We know exactly who consented to things and who didn't and when and why, right? Then I think the last piece would be, again, I think we have an opportunity to set how applications are built, how data is stored, how users interact. It's a paradigm shift, just like going from desktop to mobile, just like mobile to cloud, cloud to SaaS. Like this is going to be a major paradigm shift in how we're doing this. And right now, I believe the collective intelligence of our industry is one that can sort of drive that. We can push that forward the way that makes sense. Because if we get a bunch of politicians listening, if we get a bunch of politicians who are not data nerds, who are not in this space, and they're saying, I want it done this way, well, that might not actually make sense from a computer or storage or any of those pieces perspective. So let's start now. Before it becomes legislation, let's get to the place of best practice. What are the places that need attention? So there's my talk on maybe why GDPR isn't the best plan. Maybe it is. Again, totally open to thoughts, because I didn't come in on concrete ground today. I said, I bet I could probably pull that off. What are your thoughts? Yeah.
the registered state sex offender list that
Right.
has your name.
That's
so it's
correct.
not.
So
yeah.
I wouldn't be able to go to the actual sexual registry and have my name forgotten from that. So from the safety perspective, that. However, maybe the website that is, and again, all of this is hypothetical right now, right? Because a lot of these things haven't been challenged. But that registry site that I sell a bunch of ads on so that I can scare you and your neighbors into thinking that you're all in trouble, and probably do provide a service, right? I can petition to have it removed from there. Does that make sense? Sexualpredatorwatch.com. That is I totally get what you're saying. I would guess it has to do with where the data is stored, right? Like if the data is stored on your server, then yeah, you should have to forget me. However, if you're using REST or some sort of web-based service, I mean, this is the crappy nuance of what we're dealing with, right? It's a great question. I don't know the right answer there.
I mean, the way I think about this is a lot of just the sort of vast difference in the sophistication of how a company can manage data and how a government entity and how our civic technology systems handle data. So I honestly, I think it's fine if Google has to forget sexual predators and has to rely on state registries to do that. Do I think state registries are capable of providing that technology platform currently? No, I think we need to invest a lot of money in making our government smarter and more efficient. But I also to flip this on the side. The opposite argument to what you're saying right now is that we have in this country, and again, going back to ads to scare people into thinking, there are so many more young black men who have been unfairly convicted of drug crimes that are in news stories and should have a right to be forgotten than there are sexual predators who are getting inadvertently forgotten. So, I am firmly, as you know, this is a trolley car problem essentially, right?
It is.
How many lives have we ruined by, unnecessary convictions, unnecessary incarceration, versus the potential to ruin lives by missing one or two of these sex? I don't know. Those are really hard moral judgments, and that's not something that currently technology can answer. Maybe at some point in the future we'll get to a point where we can have that much insight into how individuals are affected psychologically, physiologically by various things. Obviously, being incarcerated at a very young age for an extended period of time has dramatic effect on the rest of your life at a level as high or higher than even a young, that's crazy. I'm not going to say that because I'm just not going to finish that thought. But I mean, there is, it's a huge issue. So, and if you look at the sheer numbers, I mean, this is the lifetime problem of there's a lot more fear than activity. Should all of that activity stop? Yes. Should we, as a society, solve that problem? Yes. But the fear is at a much higher threshold than the actual problem. And the actual problem of ruining people's lives and preventing them from being contributing members of society is on a completely different side, where the right to be forgotten actually could have a huge impact. So anyway.
No, and I saw lots of people nodding along, and I'm hoping that prompted other sort of thoughts that people wanted to share. Because the reality is, we're at this place where this is where this conversation is critically important. Not necessarily today, but in general. So I'd love other people's thoughts that were prompted there.
I have a thought that might morph into a question eventually, but in response to that, I think there's a question that needs to be asked. One of the points you had on a previous slide was accessibility to the tools request your data to be forgotten. That question of accessibility, here's my question. How well do you think companies from your size to larger size are able to provide that type of accessibility to individuals across the socioeconomic spectrum?
I think, I mean, the internet is the great game changer, right? I mean, you provide a public interface, everyone can use that. Like in our, my argument, or my comment there might be around sort of structure. What's the structure of your data? I mean, we have a very niche data set. We know exactly all of the data that we have, where it's stored and how, right? As you get into bigger enterprises, that's probably harder. But I think that's, to your point, that's the challenge. And I don't know that I have an answer, but I'm game.
So one thing that you said that kind of made me think, again, along this like intersectionality of other civil rights problems and this particular issue, but like in Europe, I think they have a fairly well-defined definition of consent.
They do.
And in the U.S., like there's case law in Alabama right now that says you can't revoke consent.
Yep.
Right?
Right.
Like, a person was acquitted of rape because she initially consented and then revoked that consent. And apparently, according to Alabama, you don't have to respect that revoke. So does that mean that once you, as a marketer, get consent in Alabama, you don't ever have to worry about it again? I mean, those are,
no,
like,
again,
how does this interplay?
Right, and we're talking about states' rights versus federal, right? And so if we pass federal law, does that trumps state law? But, you know, according to the GDPR, it has to be explicit and clear what you're consenting to, and you have the ability to revoke consent. That's all part of that legislation. Right, right. Well, there's a bunch of automated stuff, too, that gets collected that you're not even, like, I was talking with some friends. They were like, we record, it was a video gaming company. They were like, we record every action so that we can replay that entire script of the person's online game. Like, they're like, well, does that mean we have to delete that? No, just have to delete the data. Right, right.
Or how does somebody say, delete my data? It doesn't have to be over the web, if that helps answer your access question. Like, we take phone calls from somebody who got our phone number from a flyer from the library that provides our service and said, delete my data. I was like, I don't save your data because you're in Europe, but cool. But yeah, it's, if you can contact the company.
You're getting GDPR requests already, right, to delete? Oh, wow, that's cool.
Yeah, with several from Germany. We get a phone call, like, I mean, I don't, now we just cleared everything, so we don't save any identifiers, period. I have no idea who did that. I don't have your IP address, I have nothing. But it's however you can contact the company, they're required to take it.
Other thoughts?
This is a slightly different tack, and I could be completely wrong. But it was my understanding that, I mean, obviously with Google, they're very much rooted where they are. It'd be hard. But say, for example, if Google just didn't want to abide by these policies, they could just move to another country that doesn't have them. But it's based on where the citizens are from?
Correct. Right. So what's happening is companies are just no longer doing business in those countries. That's what's happening. Is they're saying, is the IP address in the EU? Cut off. We're seeing that in the marketing space. That's really been like major companies. Customers are flipping from one major email service provider to another. Like, you were on this one yesterday, today you were on this one. Because everyone's afraid, because it's like a 4% penalty of annual income. Yeah, yeah.
Is the government providing any financial support for companies to roll out the tools
Not yet.
So companies are just going to be shutting down left and right because they can't afford to make the change.
So that's what's happening in the marketing space. Well, kind of, yes and no, right? Like at the same time, should a company be solvent, right? Should we be able to pay our own way? And if there's a regulation that comes down, shouldn't it be your job to enforce that regulation? Yeah, probably, right? The bigger issue is not necessarily like, hey, I can't afford to build those tools. Yes, that happens. I think the bigger issue, at least in my space, is people that they built their business model on a dark edge, right? And they're looking at it, they're like, we can't figure out a way where we can continue to provide the service that we've promised and also adhere to this legislation. That's the bigger thing. Data append plays. People that say, I know everything there is to know about you, and I will sell it to anybody who will pay for it. A lot of those. Other questions, thoughts? This is, honestly, these are my favorite kinds of conversations because there's not an answer, I think, yet.
We have time for one or two more.
Just a quick one. So currently, Google is not obligated to, like, if we submit a request
to be forgotten.
Request to be forgotten, they have no obligation to do that currently.
Well, being that you're a U.S. citizen, I think they don't have that obligation. That is true for EU citizens, and it's being tested, and Google's pushing back. So is Facebook. I mean, we're right in the middle of this, is this a good idea thing, right? Like, it's one thing when the small companies, the small ones like us, you know, there's a legal push. We'll be like, yeah, we're good. We got this. We don't want a lawsuit, right? But Facebook's like, yeah, bring it. We're bigger than you. Albania. Yeah. Yeah. It'll be interesting. I don't know. They don't have a Gdpr, and they're not part of that yet. But again, I don't know specifically about Indian privacy law.
I had one question. Do you know if making a request, like for your data to be forgotten, does that require any type of citizenship, like verification?
No idea. Honestly, like we don't require it for our interface. It's way easier for us to just have blanket coverage to say, you want to be forgotten from the AudiencePoint system, and you just, okay, you're forgotten.
To build on to that, I don't know if it counts or not, but you can become an e-citizen of Estonia, and they are covered under the GDPR. So if that does count,
please upload your bank account information, social security number, passport, and we'll forget you. No problem. Yes, this is an argument we've had over and over again within the nerd circles I run in. Yeah, I mean, and that is accounted for. You're allowed to remember people you've forgotten. I know. Again, this is why we need smart people doing this, please. Anyway, thank you guys. This has been a good talk. Can I implore all y'all to consider doing a talk? I know that there's always open slots. I think that I keep going back to GDPR because that's what I know an awful lot about right now. If you guys are tired of talking about GDPR, talk about things you care about. And we were talking earlier. I was like, man, I would love a WordPress talk, right? Like, or even Drupal. All of these technologies that we used at one point and come back to in and out. I'd love even those. So chew on it. What do you have to share? That's all.